Well, today we are here to talk about Gen AI, and my name is Giovanna Fessenden-Fairbank. I'm thrilled to be discussing such a cutting-edge topic with fellow industry experts on this panel. As a roadmap for our discussion today, we will start with brief introductions to our sponsors and our panelists. We'll give a quick overview of what Gen AI is, and then we'll do a deep dive into the copyright infringement issues, legal compliance recommendations, case law, and best practices for companies that are operating in the Gen AI space. Our panel discussion will follow with a question and answer session around 1 p.m. Please share any questions for our panel in the Q&A box on the Zoom interface. So today's event is sponsored by Hamilton Brook, Smith & Reynolds, HBSR, and the Berkshire Innovation Center. HBSR is an IP law firm with offices in the Seaport and in Lincoln. HBSR has been advising clients all over the world for over 40 years, providing top-notch counseling on patents, copyrights, trademarks, IP litigation, all areas of intellectual property. We have an incredible team of experts in technology and that are attorneys, and they have backgrounds from every area of technology, from AI, clean tech to biotech. Our other sponsor is the Berkshire Innovation Center, and it's a startup incubator in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. And I have the distinguished honor of being of counsel at HBSR and an executive board member at the Berkshire Innovation Center. My background is in computer science, and I've been practicing intellectual property law and managing my clients' global IP portfolios for over 20 years on software innovations, specializing in blockchain, AI, and other computer technologies. I also provide litigation and trademark branding counseling. My fellow panelist and mentor is a partner at our firm, Mary Lou Wakimura. She's also the chairwoman of our firm. She's a pioneer in helping clients patent their AI inventions. Mary Lou, please say a few words about yourself.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. I'm a principal of the firm, as Giovanna mentioned, and I've had the pleasure of being in private practice with this HBSR IP boutique for over 35 years. My technical background training is as a software engineer, and I counsel clients in the computer-related and software-related space, handling issues from patentability, subject matter, as well as open source software licensing, copyright of software, the whole range under the IP umbrella. I'm honored to be here today. We have a wonderful set of distinguished panelists. Thanks, Giovanna.
Super. Les Long is IP counsel for the international and French aircraft manufacturer Dassault, which was founded in 1929. Dassault is a pioneer in aviation technology, but is also a pioneer in AI. Les has joined us today from Paris to share his expertise in AI. Les, please say a few words.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Long. I'm intellectual property counsel for Dassault Systems. I am in Paris this week, but I'm based out of Waltham, so local to most people on the call, most likely. So I work on everything from standard software licensing deals, but also some of the more complex open source and now AI topics that are coming up for us. And we do make everything, software from computer-aided design to everything from airplanes to chemical structures. So it affects not only a lot of our software tools, but those for a lot of our customers.
Awesome. And Steve Kurlowecz, who's VP and Chief IP Counsel at the IBM spinoff Kyndryl. Steve comes to us with decades of experience in AI and software, having been senior IP counsel at IBM and then starting his career at Lotus. Steve?
Hello, all. As Giovanna mentioned, decades makes me sound old, but I do have decades of experience, both as a software developer and later an IP attorney. Kyndryl manages other folks' IT infrastructure. So it's a complex business of managing data centers and desktops for third parties. I'm responsible for all aspects of IP protection for Kyndryl and IP enforcement.
Awesome. Great. So let's get down to about Gen AI. Now, Mary Lou, will you give us a brief overview of Gen AI?
Sure. I'm going to give Leslie Swanson a moment to introduce her as well. Wonderful to have these.
Yeah, no, here, I'm so sorry. I jumped over her. She is not to be forgotten. So Leslie Swanson, CEO of eXalt for 23 years. We are especially grateful to have her today because she just returned from a business trip from Southeast Asia. And she's a real trailblazer in AI space. I affectionately like to consider her the queen of Gen AI chatbots. Leslie, please introduce yourself.
After that, I don't know what to say. My goodness. Thank you, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As you mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of eXalt Solutions. I guess the soundbite of what we do is we help companies scale their business by creating AI-based customer experiences and specifically AI-based customer journeys. So we do that for a whole variety of IT type products, but primarily in B2B, but we also can do that in B2C.
Awesome. Lovely to have you. All right. So Mary Lou, Gen AI, what is it?
Great. Thanks, Giovanna. We've heard phrases over the years, neural networks, AI, artificial intelligence, and now Gen AI. All under that overall category of machine learning. So how are these words related? Are they different? And I like to start with a historical point back in the early 1960s when neural networks started to gain traction and recognition, being implemented as a system of equations, math models. And the point of those models were to mimic human decision making. The way those models were configured and trained had certain weights on model parameters that were adjusted or configured based on training data, and in particular, somewhat cause and effect type of factors. So for particular factors, the A, B, and C, which were the cause, the 9 out of 10 times, the result was the effect. So that kind of cause and effect specific factors, when used as training material, the greater the range of those result examples or specificity going into the training data set, then the more fine-tuned that neural network model could be. So the early on neural network models were statistical in nature based off of that kind of training and provided discrimination or classification of subject input. So the subject input to an AI system, the engine that is applying the tuned model, the engine output would be a prediction, such as in speech recognition, next in sequence pattern recognition, image classification, and some natural language processing. Let's fast forward. In more recent decades, the improved model has the ability to generalize, not just memorize the cause and effect factors in a statistical manner. So that ability to generalize is what the generative AI model has. And the generative model learns patterns, large language portions, as well as structure of the training data, not just the end factors equaling a certain effect. So that more generalized kind of learning, once trained, the subsequent model can actually compose and formulate new data, new content that has similar characteristics. So in that sense, the Gen AI model output is not a prediction of a next in pattern sequence or a classification, such as in the old days of the neural networks, the beginnings of AI. Instead, that output is generating whole new images, whole text paragraphs, machine translations. And listed here are some examples of that generative AI systems. The large language model chatbots in ChatGPT. That's a well-known example these days. Text to image type of art systems, Midjourney as an example. Text to video generators, as in Sora, many others, and various corporations, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, have developed their own Gen AI models. So when I hear the phrase Gen AI, I think of creation of content, not just a predictor along a projection based off of statistical analysis. So in that creation of content, now we see, look around us, has raised questions that surround rights and responsibilities of Gen AI.
Super. So, I'll throw this out to Steve. What makes Gen AI so revolutionary? I mean, AI's been around for decades. What's special here? What's so transformative?
So one of the things I think that's transformative is, as Mary Lou alluded to, is the transformer-based models are much better at giving generalized answers based on what they're trained on. The second is the accessibility. We're at a point now where anybody can use something like ChatGPT. One of the aspects that make the large language models, the GPT, generalized pre-trained transformer models, so good is the fact that they're being trained on enormously large corpuses of data and end up with billions of parameters based into the model. I think it's just gotten to the level you can ask it generalized questions and get a fairly decent generalized answer.
Right, because a lot of the previous AI models were more specific, like models for detecting faces, models, not just a huge, just a model that's trained on everything under the sun. Yeah, very. And Leslie and Les, do you have anything to add about what's so transformative or unique about what the future holds with this kind of technology that is? Go ahead.
Oh, something I personally find exciting is the first generation of these transformers were going from one type of data to another, to the same type of data, text to text, image to image. And now you're seeing transformers that are capable of going from one form to another, text to image, text to video, text to music even. I think there's a few out there. And
right.
Being in a company that has a lot of different formats from, can we create, say, CAD files, which are, very precise math, parametric representations of, real things used in production from a sketch or a 2D image or a JPEG file. It's something that could lead to quite a lot of time saving and really opening up possibility for an entire large group of users to use tools that have previously required a lot of expertise. Most of the users of even of our relatively simple programs are trained engineers. Can you have somebody who's in high school and junior high basically get to the same level of expertise? I think
Right.
that's the really transformative part, that is really lowering the barrier to entry on so many types of creation. Whether it's from text to, you know, building a wheel, literally.
Right, right. I recall that the early stages when they were developing OpenAI, the earlier models, like they tried to restrict the training data and exclude data that was from other languages, but it turned out, that because there was such a large corpus of data that it was trained on, that it started to, it understood French. It could do French to English translations. It learned on its own, even though French was like intentionally tried to be excluded from the training data. So it has this amazing potential to learn on its own, just because of this huge corpus of data, of every different type of data. And that's sort of the value that we have here, is to be able to have the machine, the system, have the right to learn on as much data as possible, as similar to a human. Yeah. So now we have, Gen AI is possibly one of the most transformative and revolutionary technologies today, but it is plagued by legal issues, and in particular, copyright infringement allegations from copyright holders that are asserting their rights, that in the data that the AI systems, the Gen AI systems, are being trained on. And some notable cases recently, the New York Times has recently filed a case against Microsoft and OpenAI in the Southern District of New York. And another notable case, which we may speak about, is the Getty Images case against Stability AI. Steve, I've got our copyright infringement analysis here on screen, and it starts out with different types of data that the plaintiffs in these cases have alleged as being infringing used by the tool. So in terms of input output, can you kick it off and kind of walk us through the process here of the copyright infringement analysis?
Yeah, sure. I think when we think about, as described, how the models work, one framework to utilize is, the old standard: input, processing, and output. And here with copyright infringement, we have to think about both the inputs and the outputs. There is copying going on, even if temporary copying, on the training of the models in the first place. In order to get, a GPT-3, GPT-4, massive amounts of publicly available information was copied, trained the model, and, as I understand it, generally thrown away. There is no exact copy within the representation of a neural network or a GPT model that is the expression that it was trained on. It's a transformation of that into a model. So there's some questions of copyright infringement on the training side. And there's a dozen or so lawsuits. Giovanna highlighted two of the more high-profile ones that are going on. There's many class action suits that represent authors of books: Sarah Silverman, Tremblay. There are music providers, software coders, parts of different class action lawsuits. And they allege mainly direct copyright infringement and violations of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, which requires you to maintain, not remove, any copyright management information, metadata about the owner of that. Many of the learning, by its very nature that these training processes utilize, drops that on the floor. There's no need for attribution. They just want, if you will, the core functional part of what the article or web page is saying. So right now, most of the suits that we're hearing about are focused on that. They're all very, very early on. The best indications we have generally are motions to dismiss by the defendants that allude to what their defenses will be. And as Giovanna has laid out below, they must all look to a fair use analysis on this. On the output side, that's yet to be truly tested. If you generate, my feeling, personal feelings of Steve, is that the current copyright regime we have in law and case law, statute and case law, is sufficient to analyze the issues being brought up by this very cutting edge technology. It is fundamentally, did you have access to a work and did you create something substantially similar? That will be the test, I think, on the input cases. On the output, if you're a user of a model and you create something that is substantially similar, I think you are going to be on the hook for having to defend that against a copyright infringement. Where the liability lies, in general, from an architecture perspective, there are model developers like OpenAI, like Stability with its Stable Diffusion model, Google with Gemini, many others. There are deployers of those models. So you can consume OpenAI's model through Microsoft. And generally, that's where users are getting, and users are the ones that access the model, typically via a deployer of the model. Sometimes the model developer is also the deployer. But as a user, you look for protection generally from the deployer. Microsoft announced the copyright commitment last October. It has some carve-outs for how do you use it. But I think, Giovanna, to answer your question, it's going to be a standard copyright infringement analysis, and we'll have to see on the model developer side where the courts come down on what might be called fair training techniques that the model developers use along the lines and principles of fair use.
Right. So in terms of like mitigating risk for developers in this space, ideally, one approach would be to try to, if you're going to, be scraping data from the internet, for example, to only extract ideas and facts if possible. So if there's like a smart scraper that is configured to have some kind of intelligence, and I know that there's a long history of case law in the United States about that ideas and facts are not copyrightable content. I know, Leslie, you sort of modeled your business practice on that. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I guess this points to that decades of experience but early on, actually in projects that we even had in the CAD industry, where we were summarizing all of the characteristics of products, we always held to the standard that even though we would copy something in mass, right, or scrape it in mass, as long as we transformed it in a meaningful way, and as long as we were keeping to the characteristics or facts about the products, the fact that we would extend that set of data or content, right, or augment it in certain ways, that even though we were taking it 100% lift and copy, the fact that we were transforming it extending it, augmenting it, that, we were always in a safe position. And, you build all kinds of machines to do that, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't just happen by itself. So that is something that we still hold till today, even if that machine is something that's AI based.
Right, right. So if you can't get around, if you have to, if you just only limit your scope to facts and ideas, if you're able to do that, that's best case scenario, no infringement. But then if you have to include the copyrightable content, are you copying also the expression? And that's, I think we're seeing in, at least with the output, it's hard for plaintiffs to prove that. And notably in the New York Times case, we have the situation where they, Microsoft and OpenAI have, pleaded that perhaps that the New York Times hacked. I'm sorry, perhaps, yeah, the New York Times hacked their system in order to get to force it to output potentially infringing content, which is interesting because I mean they also have alleged that it is a violation of their terms of use. So they're creating evidence that causes the system to produce a natural output that it wouldn't normally. And is that evidence even admissible? I mean, they did not even provide in terms of authenticating that evidence. The New York Times didn't present any of the data about what was actually input in the system to cause it to output that content. So it's a little hairy, and I even wonder, if at this point that particular case is just on a, Microsoft has moved to dismiss it. But if they do end up, if it survives dismissal, I wonder if they'll counterclaim for, a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act claim against the New York Times for, breaching their terms of use. And so that's another authorized access, and then, forcing the system to output infringing content. So these are sort of creative options to retaliate, but that's an interesting question. If you force the system to output infringing content by violating its terms of use, is that actionable? I don't know. It remains to be seen, right? So any thoughts? I mean, I think that, Steve, when you talked about that the laws are we already have over 100 years of law on fair use that that is pretty clear, and even the more recent case law is applicable. So we don't need to create new law. But I wonder, in terms of for regulations and the rules of evidence, they might have to try to figure out some new approaches to reduce the deep fakes that you might get in submitted in evidence as for lawsuits these days. So that might be an area where it might need some refining. But from the copyright perspective, it looks like copyright law is already, I would agree with you, Steve, that it probably does not need to be modified in any way. It's already perfectly capable of addressing this new revolutionary technology.
I agree. That's not to say this is going to be an easy decision for the courts to use that solid framework in this, as you mentioned, and is very timely. I see that Microsoft, I think yesterday, filed their motion to dismiss against the New York Times allegation. Microsoft, of course, separate from OpenAI itself, both are named in the suit, both provided their own motions to dismiss. Previously, OpenAI focused on a fair use. Microsoft, I think, was a little more explicit. I haven't read the details of the complaint, of the motion to dismiss, other than to skim, but they're focusing on the practicality of what was produced. How practical is that to actually happen? And one of the things you'll notice if you use generative AI from a third-party provider, which almost all of us do, it is very few companies that are going to build their own LLMs at the scale of a GPT or a a Gemini, is that your indemnification from these companies for the outputs that you produce is limited to the extent you intentionally try to make it create copyright infringing material. If that happens, you lose your indemnification. Along those same lines, with the evidence, I haven't seen directly, but I'm guessing, all defendants in these cases have asked for discovery on exactly what prompts and meta prompts were used to create this output. And I suspect, I have no evidence, but I suspect you're going to see they had to twist it on its head to come up with that soccer player in full motion that Getty Images claims was produced and infringes their copyright in their images library, or the excerpts from the New York Times that New York Times alleges infringes. So it's going to be, well, the framework I think is solid, if you will. The strategy is solid. The tactics of how they apply it in the cases is going to be very, very interesting. And Leslie Long, I know you and I have discussed, some of the case law around Google as well. And I think that's going to have a way, it's going to weigh in the factors in this case.
Meaning the Google and Oracle case, or the Google books, like which case? Yeah.
So personally, and Leslie, I know you and I have discussed, I think the Google Authors Guild case is going to hold a lot of sway here. I also think that I think it's Smith, the photographer, against the Warhol Foundation for the prints that went up to the Supreme Court last year. And I would argue narrowed the fair use argument when you can make a case that it's substituting in the market for the original work. The Google case on the APIs, I'll let Leslie talk about, because I would rely less heavily on that, I think, than some.
Well, and so in our prior discussion, I pointed out that the Google Oracle case, was decided on fair use and was kind of unexpected. It had been discussed in briefings, but not heavily. And this is just my personal opinion, but the Supreme Court, at least its courage makeup, I think, was sort of reading in between the lines and thinking that, disrupting and saying that this wasn't fair use and was infringement to basically copy a bunch of header files for purposes of interoperability would be a massive disruption to the software industry. And they were not going, the Supreme Court was not going to disrupt that, as an outcome, barring some very, very clear-cut law, and basically pass the ball back to Congress to fix. So, if these generative tools gain traction and keep traction, and it certainly looks like they're due, depending on what the makeup of the court is in the future, could they come to a similar conclusion of, well, these tools are in the market, they're a significant portion of the economy, we're not going to just shut the door on this type of use, at least in a general case. And I think, outside of the case law, you're now seeing a lot of efforts on promoting safe AI. I believe the White House has developed some initial guidelines, or at least the intention to develop those in the future. And I think, producing a model which doesn't infringe copyright is going to be one of those elements among, many others on on bias and other things. So I think the question will be is if you are training a model, particularly at a very large scale like OpenAI or Stability AI, how, and providing a service, how much do you have to basically try to suppress content, knowing that you're going to have some users that are going to try to use it for infringing purposes? How far do you have to go, not only in your terms of use, but also on the back end and try to suppress that with other LLMs that are going to search for copyrighted content and test for similarity and so on?
So there's going to need to have some kind of mitigation in the from the system to reduce the chances that the output could be infringing, even if you're trying to sort of hack the system to force it to produce infringing output.
Yeah, I believe so. Ultimately these are not deterministic models; they're probabilistic. So if you run a prompt 1,000 times, you could get an infringing one, even if it's not 900 times, 999 times. Is a court going to say, well, it does it once out of 1,000 times, therefore it's infringing? I think from a practical matter, I would think no, but it's really going to be very fact specific. If it's something like what Steve is hypothesizing of, the New York Times is, very intentionally trying to promote, through prompting and meta prompting, get a result that it knows is infringing just as sort of almost a gotcha. The courts are, through discovery are likely to say, well, are what are you really doing here? You're not finding copyrighted content. You're digging in and getting the very rare case that pops up when it's not really a tool that's built to do that or intended to do that.
And I would bet that it wasn't just your average New York Times person that generated those prompts. I mean, I think that was probably a very sophisticated individual that understood ChatGPT inside out, and they were a true prompt engineer, right? That knew how to provoke it. And I'm sure, the number of times they tried was much greater than, single digits. I think they, so but any
Right.
product, get it to do something illegal, right? Any product.
Right. It's if you're going to circumvent the product, like, who's liable for that? So, these it comes down to this investigator that they hired to produce this infringing, or this to cause ChatGPT to output this infringing content. The OpenAI contends that they forced it to produce this content using well-known vulnerabilities with the system, like with hallucinations that the system is prone to. Leslie, do you or Steve or either Leslie, anyone, could you speak to what a hallucination is in terms of a Gen AI system? So
Steve.
I can give you my sort of common sense answer, which is, fundamentally within the neural network model, it is all about relationships between words that the neural network is making. These relationships are based on the word itself. So you've probably heard some commentators say, well, all generative AI is guess the next word. It forms phrases by guessing the next logic, or not guessing, by developing or producing the next logical word. And, you build the phrase out, then you build sentences out, then you build paragraphs out. And, subsequently you've got, a 3-pager on some topic that you asked about. Leslie mentioned the non the nonlinear the nonlinear operation of the model. It's not deterministic. You can give the exact same prompt in the model because of its weights, because of things it's done, it may produce a slightly different answer. You know, hopefully it's not producing something 180 degrees off. But kind of a riff on that, as I understand it, are these hallucinations. If you give it certain prompts with words that can be used ambiguously, the one I've heard an example made of is bank. Depending on the context, if you're talking about money and you say bank, we know one thing. If you're talking about fishing on a river and you say bank, we're thinking of a very different thing. So if you prompt it and you don't give it enough context, you really think you're asking about investment strategies with a financial organization, you may get a tip on fly fishing and wonder where that came from. And part of it is you'll wonder for the rest of your life because it is a black box. And the data scientists I've spoken to will all tell you, we can't really tell you what the path through the model from beginning to end was to produce that output. We know what it was trained on. We know what the weights are, the weighting of the relationship between various parameters in that model. But we cannot, as in traditional programming, go through if then else logic to say, oh, this happened, so therefore we went to this step, and that happened, therefore we went to this step. The models are non-deterministic. Part of that leads to what I think some people think of as hallucinations. I asked it the same prompt, I gave it the same prompt, came up with 2 responses. In other times, there were these non-obvious, my example is very banal, but some non-obvious associations the model has learned within itself that come out when prompted in a certain way that make you scratch your head and you think, you know, what the heck is it talking about? To me, that's a hallucination.
Great. Super. So, so in looking at the sort of fair use analysis, and a lot of it will come down to, is it transformative? And it looks like the recent Supreme Court case with Warhol sort of limits the scope of of where, if it's within the same channels of trade or in the same type of if it could be a replacement for the original work, the copyrighted work. But here we have a situation where, at least with the models themselves, there's no replacement. And even within the, so, and the output is sort of dependent on what the user requests. So it would seem like, at least with the models, they would be significantly transformative because there really isn't going to be direct matches to the copyrighted work, I would think, in the typical case. Would anybody like to opine about whether or not these models are going to be transformative enough, in the hypothetical situation when you're looking at like OpenAI or ChatGPT? I mean, you're not going to really find direct strings of text that are from the copyrighted work in the model. It's more statistical models. It's not going to be a verbatim copying of content, correct?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it transforms everything into a weight and a number, even if it's a word or a sentence. So, that all of the original content is lost. So I don't know how anyone could even think that the original content in terms of sentences or words or expressions or ideas or whatever is retained. It's not. Doesn't matter what the model is that you're using.
And
Right. Go ahead.
Les's comment about transformative across medium. So a lot of the current common uses are taking from one medium, mostly text, and then transforming it into a different type of medium, images, video, music, even the chat GPT, the conversational versus out of context use of input keyword. So I think there is currently room for that argument of transformative just from the perspective of what medium was used on input versus the output result.
Well, in other fields, even if there's a transformative result, you see, very sophisticated licensing agreements and basically an established industry for getting the rights to a book and turning it into a movie. I mean, yes, going from a text to a video is transformative, but no, it's clearly not fair use to take a book, even if it's not word for word, turn it into a script and produce a film from it. And in a simpler comparison, if I can have the copyright in a photo, and if I change it from a JPEG to a PNG, at the binary level, the file is going to look very different. But at the end of the day, it's the same image, and a court's going to not buy I don't think in a very simple argument like that, a court would not buy the argument that, oh, it's different at the binary level, therefore it's transformative. So it's one of those, I think it's going to be very fact specific. And if you're going to sue a model trainer, a court's really going to look at is, what is the model trainer really doing? Is it a general tool, or is it somebody building a tool for the purposes of trying to copy a specific type of text or a specific style?
Right. And, with Gen AI being, it needing to have a huge data set, and the value that we get from having it be so advanced, like for the future of these models generated from it, ideally, it needs to have it as a diverse data set as possible. And if humans are allowed to read what's online, what's publicly available without restriction, why can't machines? Like, Steve, we talked about the fair learning, the right, for fair learning, and these machines, in order to improve and to excel and to advance for AI to reach its potential, it needs as diverse of a data set as possible. And why shouldn't it be able to train on publicly available content that doesn't have restrictions? I mean, if the content itself has the terms of use and says you can't train on it, then then it can stop there. But if you're allowed to train on it, if it doesn't have any restrictions, then certainly the search engines have existed and crawled pages for decades without any issue, and index that data for use. And so you would think that in this case, for AI, Gen AI, for these data sets, these large language models to be built, they should be allowed to train on publicly available data.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with that. It gets tricky around the rights and the terms of use. Traditionally, it's been very hard, other than through something technical like robots.txt being placed, in the root of a web page to tell the crawlers, don't look here, which, as I understand, most of all of the legitimate crawlers respect. But if you haven't taken that technical mitigation, but your terms of use, which I think in general, most websites with proprietary content will have, it's prohibited to copy the content off of my website. traditionally, that's been incredibly hard to do. No company has the resources to read every terms of use when you're doing general purpose web crawling. One of the arguments I've heard flipped on its head here is, well, if you've generated such smart AI systems by training on all this stuff, can't the generative AI system read the terms of use and determine whether or not it's allowed to further train, because it now has the smarts to analyze the terms of use to determine, am I allowed to do this or not? I haven't seen that play out yet. It's an interesting argument, to have over a beer, but I don't know that anybody's asserting that in court papers today. But and this is a question Dan Dardini asked in the chat. And I think when you're asking opinions, again, me sitting down having a beer, not legal advice, but I do think this is one of the generational technologies, that we've ever seen. And to Leslie's point, with the Google API case, Google Oracle API case, is it just too important to throw a cold blanket over the industry? Not that it should run rampant, drunk, and disorderly, but I have the feeling that technology is too important to do that. My feeling is that the focus will not be on the training of the model. I think ultimately that will be found to be some form of fair use, whether they establish new case law on factors or not. Running the model itself, as Leslie Swanson was saying, it's a bunch of weights. It's matrix math at the end of the day. There's no copy of that work within there. Running the model is not going to run afoul, I don't think, of copyright infringement. I think the focus is largely going to be on the end users who produce content and then do something with it, modify it, publish it, especially distribute it, and then the third-party content owners will assert. They'll assert against the end users, in my mind. The end users will look back to the deployers for indemnification if you're using an enterprise system, where I think most of this activity is going to occur. And it's going to be a question, that Microsoft is posing right now in the New York Times case. Did you do something unnatural to create this? Did it just, with a natural prompt, spit something out that was infringing? And if it did, it may be a valid claim by the third-party content owner. You, as the user, may be indemnified by your deployer, and then it becomes a contractual issue on that. But I cannot believe the courts are going to come down hard on the training of these large language models and throw a wet blanket on the entire industry. I'm sure others have different have opinions.
I think that your prediction sounds like a good one, and I would agree with that. I hope it turns out that way. But at least, it's in terms of focusing on the direct infringer for the output, that brings you back to a lot of Napster and, these other service providers that were providing a system that could be used for nefarious purposes to distribute infringing content. But there, I think that was part of the intended use of that product and part of the success. And I think with these Gen AI products that are out there, that's not the intended use. They're working very hard to try to mitigate any infringing content for the most part. So being mindful of the timing, so we could also get to questions, but I just kind of wanted to talk about our takeaways, our best practices for companies that are looking to operate in the space or that are already operating, and just trying to capture some of what we've discussed already, or what I anticipated we would discuss. But ideally, you want to, if you're going to launch a new Gen AI product, whether or not you are using an API from OpenAI as to augment it, or you're creating your own models, which would, as we have alluded to, it would be quite a burden and a burdensome process. And why reinvent the wheel when we have really good products already out there that can be utilized? But you want to make sure you get a legal compliance assessment before launching a new product in this space, and make sure that all the contracts, if you're going to be licensing a model for your chat bot, then make sure that all of the terms of use are not going to be, that you're going to get an indemnity. Steve, you talked about most of these companies, OpenAI, they do offer, they do provide some warranties and indemnifications, but there are some restrictions in there as well, right? So it's not, go ahead.
Exactly. And there is some carve-outs expressly in the license language, and Microsoft, which I'm most familiar with, it's one of our alliance partners, and a major producer of deployer of Gen AI. It's ultimately OpenAI's model that they are deploying on the Azure cloud platform, but they also require technical mitigations to put in place. If you're working with software developers, you've likely seen the articles on the return on investment and the efficiency of using generative AI tools, helpers to code. And one of the popular tools is GitHub Copilot from Microsoft. It requires you, if you want to maintain the indemnification that is provided with that product, to turn on an enterprise switch that tells GitHub Copilot, do not produce identical code. It was largely trained on GitHub, one of the main sources for repos for open source in the world. So if you turn that on, it will check, as far as I understand, to see if there's an exact copy of that snippet it's offering you as a suggestion in your code. If you don't turn that on, it won't do the check. It'll produce a snippet, but you're on the hook for the copyright clearance of that particular snippet. So both in the contracts and in the technical mitigations, there are some hoops you have to jump through, if you will, or guidance you have to follow to make sure you secure your indemnification.
Right. So, Leslie Swanson, with some of your chatbots, I know, so the second bullet point here I have, like, ideally you would use public domain corpora or licensed works. I mean, that would be the best case scenario for your training data. But I know for a lot of your early chatbots, it was often, you were doing product recommendations for it, or, trying to help somebody assemble a computer system, and it would recommend the different components that are compatible. And so it's crawling, and this is really, and they were partners, and it was in their interest to share this data. So it was in some effect, like mostly licensed, but at the same time, it was also factual. Like, this is the name of the product. These are the stats. Like, there's nothing copyrightable about that kind of data. So when you're talking about depending on the use case, like from the shopping perspective, if you're trying to build a system, and this is all, it is what it is. This is the name of the thing. Like, this is nominative fair use to use these terms and to crawl this data, because there's nothing unique or no copyright expression in there. So ideally, your data sets are, licensed, or you're extracting facts, or, in best case scenario, public domain databases, which I think, as more and more works are falling now into the public domain, since the Copyright Extension Act has now come to pass, that we'll see bigger databases for large language models to be trained on, hopefully. And we talked a little bit about, implementing smart scrapers that are intelligent, that can do this. And it may be, depending on where the case law goes in these cases, maybe we need an audit trail to show, like, this is what we trained on. I had a license, right? And I don't know how much of that is actually being implemented, but I know it's certainly as a recommendation, a practice tip, right?
The scraping is something that a lot of people overlook, but that's not an easy thing to do sometimes. And we find everybody gets focused on, the tech, but the low tech part of the tech, is that 90% perspiration and then 10% inspiration. The scraping shouldn't be underestimated as a critical success factor. Based on our experience, maybe other people's is different, but yeah. It's you think it's going to be easy, but it's not easy sometimes to get stuff. It's not all a magic API.
Right.
And Giovanna, to your second point on the logging, it's something I think about a lot here. As we've seen recently, both from cases about inventorship using generative AI, or the generative AI itself inventing. The courts have, pretty much stood in unison that it needs to be a human inventor. They can use a tool, but there has to be a human inventor. The Copyright Office has issued, similar guidance and regulations to say, generative AI output in and of itself is not copyrightable. But using generative AI as a tool where the human author provided, and I'll get the exact term wrong, but the creative inspiration for the work is copyrightable. I think what we're going to see in the future, and of course, you want copyrightability in the works you create, individually or as a company. I especially want to be able to register copyright in software and enforce that if someone is copying Kyndryl software. Well, how do I prove how much my program has had the creative inspiration to write the code, and how much of it was actually the suggestion from the AI was the dominant essence of the code, the creativity? I think systems that, if you will, IDEs for development environments will, in the future, have to grapple with, do I keep a log of what the interaction was to produce the final piece of code? What did you start with? How much was it a suggestion? How much did you modify the suggestion? What does it look like when it comes out? I think these are all, as I said, with the statutory law, I think the framework is solid. I think, quote, the regulatory advice from the Copyright Office and the case law on inventorship and patents is solid. But the devil's in the details as to how to apply it for a given, use case. The old adage, bad facts make bad law. I think we're going to see a lot of very fact-intensive queries about whether or not you can legitimately claim copyright in your work, and then accuse me of infringing that.
And I think from more on the software engineering side than even the legal side, you're going to see changes in how code reviews are done. Developers, I think for most large organizations have some sort of code review process before new code is released, whether that's a developer reviewing another developer's code or doing automatic quality checks for formatting or, whatever, properties of quality you want as a company. And I think you're going to see workflows start to account for this of where, let's check this, before we put this code in production, let's see how much of it looks like AI generated, how much of it is just based off existing open source that should be caught by, by your existing process and tools for seeing if you're using open source code in your product stack. And I think you could see similar there's scanners to detect open source and in a source code scan, you might see similar tools of, well, does this code look generated? And I think there will be sort of also an increased emphasis on developers signing off. I think that's something that's very now seen as very old school in development of having individual developers sign off saying, yep, this is my code, almost sort of similar to engineers of at the end of the day signing their their notebooks saying this is the work I did for today. I think you could see some of that start to come back, and sort of, I don't want to say tracking developers, but making sure that they're the ones putting in the legwork.
Right. There's sort of a chain of custody and audit trail that can stand up in court should there ever be challenged. Want to be able to attest to this being an original work or this portion is AI generated, and you can make it clear what's new and what's old and what's open source. So having that sort of all detailed out is going to be, I would say that's going to be pretty important, especially if in litigation or in due diligence, just making sure that, if that you actually own this or it's not infringing. So along the lines of using Gen AI code, what are the risks for that in the open source space? Like we have the GitHub lawsuit. Any thoughts? About risks with open source software being that's AI generated and then licensing it as open source. Potentially it may contain infringing content that is then going to be licensed out to the community for all to use.
Go ahead, Liz.
I was gonna say, I think that's the worst case for scenario for a lot of companies, and there's always seen this the nightmare scenario of you insert a line of GPL code in in your proprietary program, and it gets found out, and somebody demands you release your source code for your proprietary program. And I think the instances of that actually happening and frankly enforcement of the GPL is pretty rare. But it is still a risk, and just as at the end of the day, you have to trust your developers somewhat. If we have thousands of developers in my company, if somebody's going to copy a line of code off of Stack Overflow or GitHub, I'm not going to be able to walk over their shoulder and say stop that. But you have to have processes and tools in place to enforce that. No, this is not how you do this. You don't just go grab code from Stack Overflow. So I think it will come back on either using a tool that gives you a very strong identity if you're using Copilot on GitHub, for instance, or having checking processes in place, whether you're using scanning tools, or some other means that may not even exist right now to say, is this generated code or is this handwritten code?
Yeah,
Right, for sure.
I think, +1 on that. A lot of it comes down to your clearance process today for contributions to open source, in my mind. And just as we can't, as Leslie was alluding to, we can scan code before it goes out. We can look for licenses and other things. We can look to see if it contains snippets from open source, and if that open source is GPL licensed. Most enterprise class code scanning tools, Red Hat, not Red Hat, sorry, Black Duck. I get my colors and companies and animals mixed up sometimes. Black Duck, Mend, which was White Source before, will do such things. I think you do the same for generated code, as well as the belts and suspenders. Make sure your code generation system is as protected, indemnified as possible. But I don't see any unique generative AI issues, unique open source issues that generative AI introduces personally.
It's the same clearance process, yeah. Great, and then I'm just looking at our tips here. One other issue that we didn't talk too much about, but there are, some Gen AI systems that will use the user prompt data as to train on. So it will retain that and add it to, use it as part of its training data to build models on. And as we suggested that, the user input data, there's some risks there, but they may be trying to elicit, infringing content. It may include infringing content. There's all sorts of potential risks with using that data. And so that's something to consider, right? So if you're going to add that the user input back into your corpus of training data, that presents some risk, and you want to make sure you get permission, at least from the user, to use it and have them attest to the fact that they have the right to provide that data. But I know, like Steve, for example, you tend, at least with your systems, you tend to not retain that data for to train on, right? Is that?
Well, so we don't build LLMs. The thing I think I see us doing is potentially fine-tuning an LLM by providing our own, if you will, Kyndryl proprietary information into it. But that would be, we would get an instance of a general LLM and train it in our own tenant and keep it locked down in our own tenant. To the extent we're doing that, we don't have the issue of generally scraping data. Very simplistic way, but the way I look at this is the LLM provides just general knowledge of things. If I fine tune it with specific subject matter, domain expertise on something, I've produced another LLM, but I'm doing that with data that I very likely created myself, or I know I have licenses to. And, you can also, if you will, temporarily train the model. It's not technically training because the model doesn't change, through something called retrieval augmented generation. You might hear the term RAG, which stuffs meta prompts with the subject matter domain information such that it's going through the prompts but never training on the model. So I think the training data issue is going to come down to a very small set of companies that are creating these mammoth GPT models. And if you're doing something of a smaller domain-specific model, it is likely that you have much, much more control of the data you're putting into it, because often you want it to be proprietary or licensed from a specific source, is my thought.
So let's get to our question and answers here. Steve, you mentioned Dan Dardini's question. And so in terms of, does anybody have any thoughts? Dan says, it seems like the courts, including the Supreme Court, have expanded fair use in Google v. Oracle and the Google book case as a defense, but increasingly along technical lines, not cultural or aesthetic. Do you think courts will conclude Gen AI tools that they're too important to thwart, or just find their method of scraping data as fair use? So that's, we talked a little bit about that, a lot about that, but it's a great question, because you know, I hope for maybe both reasons that they'll consider as factors as to why it's fair use. You know, I think they both go, mostly I think that the fact that it is that they're so important, that is also goes to how transformative they are, because how many use cases they could be applied to. And you know, where you have text being used to generate video. I mean, if there isn't anything more transformative to that, you know.
And I would add also the fair use defense and its specific statutory elements to that, where the current cases that are testing this are fairly new market areas and new commercial activity. And those are particular elements in the fair use defense that I believe the court is trying to weigh pros and cons and understand in this whole development, that we're somewhat embryonic. We're at a beginning stage. So they're carefully weighing each of those elements. And I don't think necessarily trying to move away from any one or subset of those elements, just based off of the particular facts presented and the particular time frame that we're at in all of this industry development. So I can usually read a decision and be surprised, but in looking at whole summaries across a span of time, I'm feeling it's similar to other IP areas where it's a development, and along the technology lines as well as along the case law kind of assessment line.
You know, I agree. I do think this is something that, you know, of the fair use factors, I think most people think of commercial versus non-commercial as the first one and the most important one. And I think both of the Google cases, both authors, you know, versus Oracle and against the Authors Guild, I think shows that the courts are much more willing to be deferential on the commercial use than maybe courts have historically been. And I think that, you know, that would be along the same lines for generative AI tools.
Super. So we also have a question about if a logo is created using a Gen AI tool, what are the risks? one thing that's interesting about that question is the Copyright Office, traditionally has a circular that it won't register logos, slogans, company names. They have a history of rejecting applications that have just a regular logo with text or stylistic text, like that you can't register a font. You can register the software code that creates the font, but so they have some exceptions there to, and it's not that what the Copyright Office says is gospel. That's can obviously be challenged in court. You could try appeal a Copyright Office decision not to register it, but. So logos are a gray area. There has to be some kind of artistic expression, some creative expression in there to meet the threshold. And it's a low bar, but it has to be a spark of originality there. But in terms of the risks, I mean, I guess it's one of those great legal answers. It just depends, right? So if you're just getting a stylized font, it's unlikely that would present much risk. But if there's going to be more ornamental, creative expression in it, then it depends on where it came from. Is it an exact copy from something it's been trained on that they don't have permission to? So I think that you might also want to look at the terms of use with this product that the digital agency is using. What are they going to indemnify you? Or are they using licensed works for their model? There's definitely a due diligence required to assess. Any other thoughts on that from our panelists?
I would say, definitely keep in mind, there are other areas of law. If you're worried about, am I using a generated logo? Am I able to protect it? Well, even if you can't register it under copyright, it should still be a registrable trademark. There is no artistic requirement for those. It's just, are you using it in commerce? And, would it be confused for somebody else's? So there's always going to be other avenues if you're looking to protect it. If you're the agency selling that, then yeah, that's a big risk. And I think in some ways it comes down to back to the basics of what does your vendor agreement say? I mean, most vendor agreements have, if you're transferring something IP related, you're going to warrant that you own the rights and you have the right to license it or the right to assign it and transfer it, and you're going to stand behind that as a commercial entity. I think this is that exam falls within that back pattern. And what risk are you willing to take on that if you're using tools in your own company and providing that to others?
And just a tangent on that, because I do think, Leslie, just what you said is important. It comes down to, what your vendor agreement says. One of the things that keeps me up at night is something like the logo example being created with the aid of a generative AI tool. And pardon me for harping on indemnification, but as an end user, that's what I look to get me out of a jam. So the traditional indemnification ends with the termination of a contract with the vendor. If I'm using product X and their generative AI technology to create output, I can't use the tool beyond the term of the contract. That would be a violation. So they're not going to extend their indemnification beyond the term of their contract. Generative AI is something brand new. You're not using the tool beyond the termination of the contract, but you could be using the output of the generative AI for years or decades. Logo is a great example. If you used the generative AI system to help you create your logo, it's not something you generally change, every 6 months, or is easy to change, because once you create it, your company is putting millions behind branding to get you brand recognition. I think one of the areas we're going to see is the vendors getting pushed a bit to provide indemnification post-termination. They are not going to like that. They like, their liability to clip off at the end of the contract, which is also the end of their payments. Taking an uncapped IP indemnity for, in perpetuity is not a situation they're going to take. We'll see where this all shakes out, but understand the difference between the tool itself and indemnification and coverage for the output from that tool, which is somewhat unique in the generative AI technology.
Great. And so we have a question about the authorship, the public domain aspect of the, let's see. So can you speak to the recent rulings about outputs not being protectable under copyright and the difference between Gen AI systems versus other established mechanistic digital tools such as photo editors and video intuitive animators? So I think, that the recent rulings from the Copyright Office and also, with respect to patentability, is if there is some human creativity to create authorship, then as a tool, you will be able to, just because you're using a tool doesn't preempt you from getting a copyright on it, as long as you're adding some kind of spark of originality, some kind of creative expression to the content to create it. But if you're just doing something generic, something that has no creative expression, you're not augmenting it in any way, you're not prompting the system to create with something to create something unique, like draw a cat, or that might not be enough, but draw a cat with, pink ears and a yellow tail and stripes and, all these details, that might get over the threshold for copyrightability. So it, again, is one of those answers that it depends, on how much creative input you put into the digital tool to actually be able to create a copyrightable work.
I think it's a good point. And I think Beth asked the question, how different is this than cameras were in the late 1800s when there was a challenge to copyright on a photograph. Today I pick up my iPhone and I take a picture, and my understanding is that at least 7 pictures are taken, and some form of AI running in my iPhone is doing a bunch of work to get me the best picture presented. As was mentioned, the bar to creativity is extremely low. We've seen monkeys take selfies. They weren't copyrightable, but not because they weren't creative, but because the monkey wasn't human. So I think this follows in the long line of tools. And these days, if, I've got an almost 2-year-old granddaughter, she can pick up an iPhone and she can press that camera button and she takes a picture. It's copyrightable by the current standards, and I think we're going to see that. Any challenges to it, we're going to have to look at what Giovanna was talking about. Does it breach that line? Do you have any backup as to what you did with the tool to create your work? But I think the creativity bar is extremely low, and I don't think that's gonna change for this technology.
One aspect of it, though, will be interesting to see how it plays out, is you certainly can't take like a public domain work, like take a picture of, a Leonardo da Vinci, and be and try to claim copyright on that unless there's some real creative expression. So taking works that are already in the public domain and trying to like tweak them a little bit and get a copyright on that will be interesting to see like where the threshold is on that. Like how far do you have to go to augment it to actually add some creative expression? Because you can't just, you know, that would be defeat the purpose of copyright law in the first place. So it is supposed to be protection for a limited amount of time. So we can't have, you know, entities extending the copyright for hundreds of years just by taking a picture from a different angle of a piece of work that's in the public domain.
Agreed. I think it has to be a derivative work with some independent copyrightable addition made to it. And then again, I think it's the traditional analysis.
Right. So we are at time. And we have many other questions, but I think we'll try to get back to you unless somebody wants to opine about one of the other questions before we go.
Yeah, just one quick, there was one question about a developer publishing open source code that might be generated by a Gen AI tool and then infringing. Who is responsible there? Historically, open source projects are very ethereal and hard to sue. So I think there's practicality issues there. Debian, for instance, which Debian is a distribution of Linux, intentionally does not have any legal entity, and they just work as individual developers. So unless you're willing to sue individuals around the world for copyright infringement, it's very hard to get any judgment. Different open source projects are sponsored by companies, they're sponsored through foundations which are, you know, very large and have assets to go after. That might change the fact pattern, but you know, an individual developer just releasing something open source code, if it's infringing on that, I mean, it's almost the same question as if they're copying your source code. Now, you know, is it really practical to go after an individual? I mean, if it's very easy, say they're just putting the code on GitHub, you just send a DMCA takedown, and hopefully the code goes away. Otherwise, it's a resource question, I think.
Right. So, you know, I think that we've had a fantastic event, and I'm so grateful that you guys we got to have this phenomenal panel from experts in the industry, great legal minds, and this is a hot ticket issue, and I'm super excited about where the future is heading for this technology. It is got so much promise and so much potential, and hopefully it won't be impeded by bad facts for bad case law to be developed. Hopefully we'll get some rich, good case law that will support innovation in this space, because this is the future. And we want to embrace it if we can do it in a respectful way to all the copyright owners and have the freedom to operate in this space. Thank you all for coming, and please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists, the attendees, if you have any questions. We're here to help, and we look forward to seeing where this goes to the future. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye. So long.
Yeah.